Good morning, friends. I am Sachin Ketkar. I teach English at the MS University of Baroda, and today we are going to talk about appreciation of poetry. The title of this presentation is The Dance of Language, Appreciating Poetry. And what I'm going to do basically is I'm going to talk about what poetry is, what is it made up of, and how does it work. The presentation will end with a kind of tips and suggestions about how to read a poem. And I will be actually discussing two poems. One is a very famous poem by William Wordsworth titled A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal, and other one is more recent, a newer poem by a well-known American poet called Mark Strand. And the title of the poem is Eating Poetry. So what we are going to do today is basically we are looking at how poetry is the way language dances and how poetry is to be eaten. So let's have a look at this topic. Friends, in the broadest sense, poetry or literature is art of using language. And when I say art, philosophically speaking, art would mean the ways in which we expand and diversify the ways of seeing and ways of being in this world. It's a very abstract notion, so let's keep it aside for a moment. If you look around us, poetry is everywhere. Though in our classrooms, poetry is not very popular, poetry is actually everywhere. If you look at our film songs, if you look at our religious literature, if you look at our devotional songs, if you look at our film songs, if you look at songs when the television serial starts, if you look at advertisement jingles, if you look at lullabies, if you look at folk songs, if you look at garba, everywhere it's poetry that is around us. Poetry surrounds us, and that is the reason why we study it carefully. It's very important to understand poetry if you want to understand our culture, or any culture for that matter. So let's start looking at poetry. The intention of this discussion is that we are going to understand the ways in which poetry works, and the ways in which poetry dances, and the ways in which poetry can be read. So let's have a look at the slideshow and small slide presentation that I have brought along. So let's have a look. I'm going to use two ideas before we start discussing poetry. First is the etymological definition of poetry. The word poetry is taken from the Greek poetica, which is derived from the words poenin, which means to make. Hence, poetry is something that is made, constructed, artificial. And the ways in which a poem is made are called poetic devices. Poetry is something that is made. This whole idea of poet as a maker is something that we should keep in mind when we look at poems. So this is the first idea, that poem is something which is made. Let's look at another idea which I'm going to use in my presentation. This insight, a very powerful insight into poetry, comes from a well-known French poet named Paul Valéry. He makes a very useful and important distinction between prose and poetry. He says, poetry is to prose as dancing is to walking. This is a very interesting phrase that he uses. Poetry is to prose as dancing is to walking. He says in his lecture called Poetry and Abstract Thought, 1939, a lecture given at Oxford. So what does it mean? What does Valéry mean when he says that poetry as dance? Valéry means that prose, and discursive prose in particular, is largely about conveying message or information, and hence it's goal directed. When we say prose is like walking, it means that it has to reach from point A to B or D. It is linear in direction. It has got a straight direction. So prose usually moves in straight direction from point A to point B, and the whole idea behind prose is to reach a particular point in space and in time. On the contrary, poetry is not about going anywhere. Poetry is not basically about giving information or conveying some message. Poetry is not goal directed like prose. It does not have a fixed location to reach. It has got no station to reach. It may start from point C and go to E and come back to A, right? Non-linearly, like a dancer. Dancer goes around in circles. The way dancer occupies the stage is the way language occupies the stage in poetry. The use of language which has these twists and turns are called tropes or figures of speech. The word trope literally means twist and turns. So poetry is made up of these twists and turns, and that is why it dances. So how does a poem dance? Poem dance because it uses turns, twists, and tropes. So these are the two insights that I'm going to use in my analysis of poetry. I think these are very useful distinctions to make. Hence, in today's presentation, we will discuss what is poetry made of and how it dances. Let's look at this poem in greater detail. We'll look at this as a poem that is to be analyzed in our present discussion. This is a very famous poem by William Wordsworth, and the title is the first line of the poem, "A slumber did my spirit seal." And I suggest, if your friends, if you are having your notebooks with you, you can copy this two-stanza poem in your notebooks, because we are going to use it extensively for our discussion. The poem is something like this: "A slumber did my spirit seal. I had no human fears. She seemed a thing that could not feel the touch of earthly years. No motion has she now, no force. She neither hears nor sees, rolled around in earth's diurnal course, with rocks and stones and trees." So this is a two-stanza poem, a very famous poem by Wordsworth, and we are going to look at this poem in detail for our analysis. What is the first thing that you have to keep in mind when you come across an unseen poem? For many of you, this poem might be unseen. You might be looking at this poem for the first time. So when you encounter a new poem, then some things that you have to keep in mind, that though a poem is formally distinguished from narrative or a story, each poem consists of a story in it. A poem also has got a plot, like a story has a plot. So every poem has a plot in it. Second very important thing that you have to keep in mind, that though all poetry is formally distinguished from fiction, all poems consist of some fiction. That is, there are a lot of imaginary things that have gone into making of a poem. So poem, though it is separated from fiction and from story, it consists of both fiction and story. So each poem has got an element of narrative, a story that is, and an element of fiction. So in our colleges, when we differentiate between poetry, fiction, and drama, we forget that in poetry you have all these things. Poetry, fiction, and drama are there in a single poem. So that's what it makes it interesting. So when we start reading it, you have to first try to find out what is the plot or narrative of this story. So let's look at this slide here. Very often, the speaker in the poem is one of the characters in the story which a poem tells. So if you look at this poem once again, there is a speaker in this poem, and it's a very important thing to distinguish or differentiate between a speaker in the poem and actual poet. And the reason is because a poem is also a fictional construct. The speaker in the poem may or may not be same as the poet. So when we write answers in exams, it's very important that we don't use words like a poet says this, a poet says that. Instead of that, we should use words like the speaker in the poem says this and the speaker in the poem says that. So that's one of the reasons why we should use this phrase, the speaker. Another term for speaker is also called persona. Persona is what is meant by mask. The speaker of the lines of the poem is commonly mistaken for the poet as a real person. In fact, the speaker in the poem can be very often be a mask or a fictional character or a voice, and this character which is speaking in a poem is called persona. Hence, it's a very good idea of not using the poet says approach while discussing poetry and literature. In the Wordsworth poem we have seen, the story is about a lover who believes that he was asleep when he thought his beloved was not mortal and hence earthly, but wakes up to find her dead and one with nature. The story of the spiritual awakening and the shock and the grief of this awakening is crucial for comprehension and understanding of this poem. So what is the story of this poem? The story of this poem, I'm going back to poem once again, is that the speaker believes that his beloved is not touched by nature or is not touched by earthly years. Let's look at the poem once again because I'm going to keep it in front of you. In the first stanza, the speaker says that his beloved is not touched. He thinks that his beloved is not touched by earthly years. She is above mortality and death, and he had no human fears. But in second stanza, the speaker has all of a sudden woken up to find that his beloved no longer lives, but has become part of the nature. In fact, when she is buried, she has become part of the earth. And she does not have her own motion, her own force. She cannot hear, she cannot see, but she is rolled around in earth's diurnal course. The word diurnal means daily rotation of earth. So she is rolled around in earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees. So from first stanza is a speaker who is unaware of his beloved's mortality. Second stanza, the speaker becomes aware, and this is a kind of spiritual awakening that takes place. Let's look at the formal organization of this poem. I'm going to keep this slide in front of you for a while. Look at this poem. You will see that it's divided into two parts. Prose, when it is divided into parts, it's called paragraph. But when a poem is divided into parts, it's called stanza. So 4 lines here, first 4 lines and second 4 lines are 2 stanzas in the poem. Most of the traditional poetry is written in meters and rhymes. If you look at words like fears, years, seal, feel, force, course, seas, trees, these words are called rhymes because they are similar in sound. The last syllable of this word is similar in sound. And the arrangement of this rhyme is called rhyme scheme of a poem. If you look at the scheme of this poem in terms of rhyme, then you will see that seal rhymes with feel, force rhymes with course, fears rhymes with years. So seal, feel, fear, years. So you can say it is AB, AB, where seal, eel is A sound, years is B sound. Seal, A, fears, B, feel, A, years, B. Force rhymes with course. So you can say it's rhyme number C. Sees is rhyme number D. So CD, CD. AB, AB, CD, CD is the rhyme scheme of this poem. It's very important to keep these things in mind. If you look at this poem more closely, then you will see that the poem is made up of a fixed number of syllables. Each line of the poem is approximately of same size when it comes to syllables. Now, what is a syllable? Syllable is that part of a word which is pronounced distinctly. For example, word slumber has got 2 syllables, slum and ber. Spirit has got 2 syllables, spi and rit. Human has got 2 syllables, you and man, right? I has got 1 syllable. So each word is made up of either 1 syllable or more than 1 syllable. So each line, if you count, then you will find that there are approximately 8 syllables in each line. A slumber did my spirit seal. I had no human fears. She seemed a thing that could not feel the touch of earthly years. So first line is of 8 syllables, second line is of 6 syllables. So if you see that there is a pattern, there is certain quantity of syllables that the poet seems to have counted the number of syllables when he wrote the lines. if you look at the first line and the lines closely, then certain syllables which are underlined in front of you are stressed syllables. A slumber did my spirit seal. Sl, sp, s are stressed syllable, and others are unstressed. So in a line there are unstressed syllables and stressed syllables, and there is a regularity here. If you look at line number 3, she seemed a thing that could not feel, also has got 3 syllables. Seemed a thing could not feel. No motion has she, no now no force, rolled round in earth's diurnal course. So alternate lines in this poem has got fixed number of stressed and unstressed syllable. So this organization of stressed and unstressed syllable, the fixed pattern that it follows, is called the meter of the poem. Meter, if you are aware of the word, is something with which we measure something. 1 meter cloth or 1 foot cloth. So you use words like meter and foot to measure the length of something. So what we are doing here, we are using these as units. Just like we use word meter while buying clothes, we are using word meter here to measure the units of syllables in a line. The smallest unit in a line is called a feet. A slumber did my spirit seal. So a slum is got 1 feet, stress, unstress, unstressed stress, unstressed stress, unstressed stress. So you can see that these are 4 units here. Let's look at the division in greater detail. Look at this. A slumber did my spirit seal. She seemed a thing that could not feel. So these smaller units are called feet. The main foot, which seems to be recurrent throughout the poem, is of the type unstressed stressed syllable. Right, like a slum is one type of feet. So these are very important notions in analysis of poem. And the analysis of meter and rhyme in a poem is called prosody. Rhyme and meters are often used to create music and a mood of the poem. It's a convention, it's a tradition, and a device that poets often use, and the study of poetic meters is called prosody. The use of rhyme and meter is one of the ways by which the language of poetry differs from the language of prose. This is one of the major distinctions between the language of poetry and language of prose. But at the same time, you have to keep in mind, most of the traditional poetry is in rhyme and meter, and most of the modern poetry seems to be avoiding this kind of fixed patterning of syllables and rhymes. So it follows what is known as free verse. The poem is an elegy or a literary form that conventionally mourns or laments the death of someone close to the speaker. There are many sub-forms or sub-genres of poetry, like the epic, a huge poem, a huge story with many sub-stories in it, like the Mahabharata, the Iliad, Odyssey, the Ramayana, the sonnet, the ballad, the dramatic monologue, and so on. So these are various sub-genres of poetry. So what we have seen till now is the metrical and rhyme patterning that goes on in poetry, and this kind of patterning and rhyming constitutes what is called verse, V-E-R-S-E, verse. It's very important to keep in mind that all verse is not poetry and all poetry is not in verse. Let's look at some other ways in which a poem dances. The other ways in which poem dances, or the ways in which the language of poetry differs from ordinary day-to-day language, comprise of the complex and extensive use of figurative language or figures of speech. A figure of speech is a rhetorical device that achieves a special effect by using words in a distinctive way. When I use word special effects, you have to keep in mind that something like special effect that goes on in films, you find special effects in science fiction films, you find special effects in non-science fiction films also. So poet uses this special effects in poetry. So what are these special effects? I'm not going to list all of them because the list is too long. I'm going to look at some of the very important figures of speech in our discussion today. If you look at the first line of the poem, the sound S, is repeated, slumber, spirit, seal. And this repetition of consonant sound is a figure of speech called alliteration. R sound in the second last line, rolled round in earth's diurnal course, is another example of alliteration. Alliteration is when you repeat the same syllable over and over again in a poem. It's a figure of speech. But if you look at this figure of speech, this is figure of speech where sound is used in a particular way. And in ancient Sanskrit aesthetics, this kind of figures of speech of sounds were called Shabdalankar. Let's look at very important figure of speech. One of the most important figures of speech in poetry is metaphor. Metaphor is comparison between two different contexts and things without use of comparing words like or as, and this kind of comparison, this kind of analogy is called metaphor. When the comparison which uses words like and as, the direct kind of comparison is called a simile. So simile and metaphor are very common figures of speech. The first line of the poem, there is a comparison between the speaker's ignorance of his beloved's mortal nature and sleep or slumber which sealed the speaker's spirit. So sleep is metaphorical. It's not real sleep that he is talking about, but he is comparing his ignorance. The speaker is comparing his ignorance or lack of knowing with sleep. So this comparison, implicit comparison, is called metaphor. It's one of the most important figures of speech in a poem. So we have seen alliteration, we have seen metaphor, simile. Now let's look at the next figure of speech. The last line of the first and the touch of earthly years is there yet another metaphors in this poem. Very important figure of speech is image and what is known as imagery. Image is a verbal representation of a sensory experience, the experience of sight, smell, touch or taste. This experience is represented verbally in words, or of an object that can be known by one or more senses like sight, smell, touch and taste. This representation is called an image. Imagery is vivid descriptive language that appeals to one or more than one senses. Let's look at some of the images in the poem. The description of speaker's dead beloved as being rolled round in earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees is an example of imagery. Imagery gives rise to pictures in our mind, the visuals that we get as if we are watching a film inside our mind when we read a poem, or as if we are watching a television program in our mind, or while we read a novel. This is called imagery. Imagery can be not just visual, but also it might be olfactory related to smell, tactile related to touch, and it can be also be related to taste. So poetry consists of very vivid imagery. The visual picture in our mind of earth revolving around the sun and consequently the body and soul of the speaker's beloved revolving around rocks, stones and trees suggests her as becoming one with nature after her death, unlike the poet. The next figure of speech after alliteration, metaphor, simile and imagery, the next figure of speech that we are going to look at, very important one, is what is understood as irony. The speaker's description of his beloved as having no motion or force and she is revolving with earth around the sun actually implies she is dead and speaker cannot be one with her. This is also because the speaker, unlike his beloved, was always alienated from nature. This mismatch between what is said and what is meant is an example of irony. In irony, there is a great mismatch between what is said and what is meant. One of very common forms of irony is sarcasm. So when you go back home to your parents with your report card and you have scored 35% and your father say, what excellent result, it's sarcasm. It's a form of irony. The speaker's opinion that it was because of the slumber which sealed his spirit, that he felt that his beloved was untouched by earthly things like mortality, is ironic. Because it's not really the slumber, but his desire that his beloved should not be touched by death, as he loves her deeply, that has made him blind to the fact that she is also human being, and in spite of the fact that he loves her, she is also prone to death like all of us. So this is irony here. There is a mismatch between what is said and what is meant. In fact, it can even be opposite at time. Let's look at the next very important figure of speech, and that is a symbol. So in the beginning we started with what is a poem made of. When we said one of the etymological definitions of poetry is that it is made, it is constructed. Then what is it made up of? It's made up of figures of speech. It's made up of conventions of rhyme and rhythm and syllable and patterning. Right? So these are the elements of a poem. Symbol is very important, one of the most important element of poetry. What is a symbol? Symbol is an image which suggests or represents something other than itself. It's a symbol always points to something else. Think of Tiranga, the tricolored flag, and it symbolizes the nation. Think of white dove, and it symbolizes peace. Think of so many other things, and they are symbolic. So symbol is something which points to something else. It represents, it stands for something else, and that is what symbol is. Let's look at the definition closely. In poetry, a symbol represents both what it is and additionally a concept or an idea. Symbol is a thing as well as a concept that is attached to it. The symbol of a white dove suggests peace, and a cow in Indian culture symbolizes maternity, fertility, auspiciousness, and divinity. If you think deeply, then the whole of our culture and language is nothing but a web of symbols. The words that we use in day-to-day life are actually symbolic. So when I say word tree, then the word tree stands for the actual tree. So it stands for. So the words are symbolic. So culture and language is essentially a network of symbol. This is a very important fact to be kept in mind when we look at poetry. And let's look at poetic symbols in the poem. Let's look at what symbols are there in the poem. Slumber, for instance, stands for the lack of knowing on the part of the speaker. It's a symbol. Slumber is a kind of sleep. So we look at this poem and we look at some of the most important components of this poem, and we found that it is full of these commonly found elements in poetry, like rhythm, like meter, like symbol, like irony, like imagery, like use of metaphors and similes. So you can see this is what the poem that we are looking at is made up of. Now I want you to have a look at another poem, lesser known but very fascinating, and I want you to read this poem. Let's look at the next poem here. This poem is called Eating Poetry by a very famous American poet, Mark Strand. Let's read this poem. Ink runs from the corners of my mouth. There is no happiness like mine. I have been eating poetry. The librarian doesn't believe what she sees. Her eyes are sad and she walks with her hand in her dress. The poems are gone. The light is dim. The dogs on the basement stairs are coming up. Their eyeballs roll. Their blonde legs burn like brush. The poor librarian begins to stamp her feet and weep. She does not understand. When I get on my knees and lick her hand, she screams. I am a new man. I snarl at her and bark. I romp with joy in the bookish dark. You can see that this is a very recent poem and a very interesting one, where the speaker is actually talking about his experience of eating poetry. So you can see that this poem is basically metaphorical one, where the act of reading or relishing or enjoying poetry is compared to the act of eating or relishing something like food. So there is an analogy, implicit comparison here. So this is basically a metaphorical poem, and metaphor is one of the most important figures of speech here. Let's look at some other important figures of speech in the poem. If you look at this poem, then there is no such division of stanza like the earlier one. Instead, you have very uneven stanzas. It's not regular 4-line stanzas as the earlier poem. If you look at the lines of this poem, then they are of unequal length, which suggests that there is no fixed metrical pattern in this poem. There is no rhyme. There is no rhyme scheme in this poem. So a poem without a fixed meter or rhyme is called free verse poem, or open form as it is called, and this is a very important form in contemporary poetry. Most of the poetry written in 20th century is free verse or open form poetry. The language of this poem is not fixed rhythmical sing-song fashion language, but the language that we use in our day-to-day life. The rhythms of this poem are actually colloquial day-to-day rhythms of language. The language which the poet seems to be using is the language of day-to-day life, and this is a major difference between traditional poetry and modern poetry. Traditional poetry use a certain kind of artificial language, while modern poetry tries to come closer to day-to-day life language. That's a very important distinction to be kept in mind. Let's look at the images in the poem. The images of ink running from the corners of my mouth. The speaker has eaten poems and the ink is coming down from the corner of his mouth. Is a very striking image. Look at the image of the dogs with blonde legs burning like brush. These images are very striking for their visual appeal. When we read this line, immediately the picture of somebody eating poetry and the ink dripping from corner of his mouth comes to our mind. When he speaks of the dogs with blonde legs, then we immediately see the dogs in our mind with their blonde legs. So this visual imagery is very striking. The speaker also talks of the librarian who is horrified at the idea of eating poetry and the sinister transformative power it has on the reader who is the speaker. What happens towards the end of the poem, if you look at the poem once again, then toward the last stanza, what does the speaker in the poem say? She does not understand. When I get on my knees and lick her hand. The speaker has started licking her hands like a dog. She screams, I am a new man, the speaker says. I snarl at her and bark. I romp with joy in the bookish dark. The speaker has started off as a human, and when he ate those poems, what has happened is that he is transformed into a dog. This transformation is metamorphosis, technically known as metamorphosis. The experience of reading and relishing poetry transforms the reader into something almost non-human like dog, into which the speaker is transformed by the end of the poem. The irony of the poem emerges when the speaker is a new man, while actually he is behaving like a dog. So he is saying one thing, I am a new man, and actually what has happened is he has turned into a dog. Now this mismatch is called irony. He is actually on his knees, licking the librarian's knees, snarls and barks at the librarian. The contrast between the human beings and the dog is symbolic one. Contrary to the humanist belief about literature as humanizing, humanist theory of literature says that literature has got a humanizing influence. The poet seems to indicate that its sorcerous power turns human being into primitive non-human being. This anti or non-humanist perception of art is characteristic of the postmodern literature. So the poem that we are reading is very typically postmodern because it says that something after reading poem, you don't become necessarily a better person, but probably you reach into your primitive source of your being and your existence, which unites you with the dog. So poetry becomes a transformative kind of effect on the reader. Now if you see the earlier poem, that poem is also about transformation, but it's in a different sense. A slumber did my spirit seal is about transformation of the speaker, who is transformed from an unknowing, naive one who believes that his beloved will never die because he loves her so much, to somebody who is aware of the fact that she is already dead and she is one with nature. So this knowledge for the speaker brings about his transformation, while in this poem the speaker is transformed into a dog. So one of the very important aspects of poetry is transformation that takes place within the poem. So these are two very important poems that we have discussed, and we have seen some of the most basic characteristics of poetry. We have seen that it's made up of words used in a distinctive way. What is poetry made up of? Poetry is made up of language used artistically in a distinctive way as to increase its impact on the reader. How does poetry dance? Poetry dances because it does not reach anywhere. As Valerie says, it has no station to reach. It is just a journey. And so poetry is like dancing. Now what I am going to do is to give you certain tips about how to read and appreciate poetry, especially a poem that is unseen. So how will you read an unseen poem? Because every now and then you will come across an unseen poem in exams, or you might get an unseen poem in your life when somebody brings a poem to you. So how will you read it? What are the ways of reading the poem? So let me give you some basic tips about reading a poem. How to read and appreciate. Let's look at this slide. Though there is no one fixed way of reading poetry, here are some tips for analysis, comprehension and appreciation of poetry. The best way to do it is by asking questions as we go along reading. Better we get at asking questions about the poem, better we get at reading, analyzing and enjoying poetry. The skills of asking questions to poetry comes with a lot of practice and interest. So whenever you come across a new poem, you have to keep on asking questions to yourself as you go along reading a poem. And whatever questions that come to your mind, whatever observations that you make about the poem, you can jot them down on the margins with a pencil. So this is one way of reading poem. This is not the only way, obviously. So here are some tips about how will you read a poem. Obviously, when you get an unseen poem, first thing that you will notice is the title. Now title is not something that is put on the top of a poem. Title has got a very important function in a poem, and we have to ask ourselves, what is the function of title? What does title do? Very often title may lead you to the theme of the poem, the basic subject. Very often the title may mislead you. Very often the poets are ironic in their selection of title. For example, Eating Poetry is about transformation that takes place after you read a poem. Has got an ironic element to it. Sometimes the title is oblique. It's not straight away. It doesn't lead you straight away to the theme or the subject of the poem. Sometimes the poem is untitled. It doesn't have many of Emily Dickinson's poems are untitled. In such cases, what editors of books often do is that they use the first line of the poem as the title, as in case of Wordsworth's poem, A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal. So what is the first question that you will ask yourself? What does the title do? Now what will you do? The second question is you try to guess the character of the speaker. Who is speaking in this poem? This is the question, the second question that you will ask yourself. Who is speaking these lines? And you can gather information about him or her. The speaker in the poem, the first poem that we have seen, is the lover who has lost his beloved. And speaker in the second poem is the reader who relishes poetry. Now you will see that very often they may be very different from the real poets. So it's very important to keep in mind the character who is speaking, the speaker, the mask. This is the second tip. Ask yourself who is speaking. Try to identify the speaker. The third tip that I give is, now you read poem carefully to find out the story or the plot of the poem by trying to guess what happens to speaker or some other characters. What is happening to people in the poem? The people may be the speaker. So this is the second question you ask. What is happening to people? In the first poem, what has happened to the speaker is that he was not knowing something, and now he has realized that his beloved is not untouched by nature, but she has become one with nature. This realization that she is dead is what happens to the speaker. The next question that you can ask is what the speaker is saying and how is he or she saying it. So what and how are very important questions that you should ask. What is the speaker saying and how is he saying it? These are two very important questions that you should ask yourself when you read a unseen poem. The speaker in the first poem is awakened by the grief due to the death of his beloved. The characters of both speaker and his beloved are transformed. The lover realizes the mortality of his beloved, and the beloved is transformed from a living human being into spirit that is one with nature after death. The beloved is transformed from a human being into the spirit that is spirit of nature. In the second poem, the speaker is transformed into a dog, to the librarian's horror. When you ask yourself how the speaker is saying, then in the second poem, the speaker is becoming ironic. He is very casual about the idea of his being transformed into a dog. The poem very closely resembles a very famous short story by a short story writer named Kafka. In Kafka's story called A Metamorphosis, one of the main characters in the story, Gregor Samsa, he wakes up and he finds that he has turned into a beetle. And the whole story is about him turning into beetle and what happens to him. And the whole story is told in a very matter-of-fact, very ordinary way, without making much fuss of him turning into a beetle. So the second poem resembles Kafka's short story. So what the speaker in the second poem seems to imply is that the poem is not a very safe thing. If you read it, you can go back to very dangerous areas of your life. After asking these questions, ask some other questions to the poem. Ask yourself, is it divided into stanzas? Are the stanzas regular? How many lines does each stanza consist of? Sometimes stanza may have 3 lines. It's called 3 lines regularly. It's called tercet, 3 line stanzas. It may have 4 line stanzas being repeated. It's called quartine. And you have to ask whether stanzas are regular or not. Let's look at the slide for some other questions. Does the poem have fixed metrical patterning? Many poems are written in a meter and rhyme. Many poems are not. The first poem is written in iambic pentameter. It's not pentameter, I'm sorry. It's 4 feet in first line, 3 feet in second line, which is very similar to ballad form. The second poem is written in the free verse format and it has got no fixed metrical pattern. The next question that you can ask is, what is the mood of the poem? The mood of the first poem is sad, serene, and philosophical. The mood of the second poem is absurd, comical, dark, and even sinister. Usually, the poems use words for creating emotional impact instead of communicating any information or message. Very often in poem, words are used for creating this kind of emotional impact and mood rather than giving you information about something. So this is how language of poetry differs in its intention from language of prose. As you go along reading a poem, making notes, asking yourself questions, jotting down your observations on the side with with pencil or a pen. What you have to do is you have to ask some more questions, like how effective the poet has been in creating this impact upon you. So you have to ask yourself, how effective is the poet? So what you have started doing is not just started analyzing or comprehending a poem, but you have also started evaluating it. And one of the values with which you evaluate a poem is how effective is the writer or the poet in doing what he is or she is doing. Then you go on asking yourself question, how does the poet use the figures of speech and other devices in the poem? Look at the images, metaphors and symbols in the poem. How well does the poet use irony? Irony, again I'm just recalling what I have said. Irony is mismatch between what is said and what is meant. It's very similar to what ancient Indian Sanskrit poeticians called Vakrokti, where there is a deviation between what is meant and what is said. There is a gap, there is a mismatch here. So irony is when you say one thing and what you mean is not exactly what you said, or it may in fact be absolutely opposite of what you said, as it happens in sarcasm. So there is a mismatch, and this mismatch is called irony. So how well has poet succeeded in creating this kind of indirect way of, oblique way of saying things? Let's look at the next question here. Please look at the slide. Yeah. Much of the impact of the poem on the reader depends on the freshness and preciseness or precision of the images, metaphors and symbols. Impact of a good poem is that it has got a very sharp, precise way of describing things in terms of images. Very often the images are very fresh, the images that you have never heard of or read about, and this freshness is what makes a poem very attractive one. There is no such thing like good poem or a bad poem. There is something like stale poem and a fresh poem. And fresh and stale obviously are relative words. So today what is fresh may become stale tomorrow. Or there might be certain forms of freshness in a poem which remain fresh over ages. And one example that comes to your mind is metaphysical poetry, whose images and symbols have remained fresh for centuries. Ask yourself if the poet's use of figurative language is effective and interesting. So these are the questions that you have to ask yourself, and all this comes with practice. Let's look at the next step. Very often, tracing the abstract nouns can lead reader to the theme of the poem or the subject of the poetry. And the use of abstract noun like spirit, earthly, force in Wordsworth poem, or the abstract noun like happiness, poetry, new man in the Strand poem indicate the theme of the poem. So it's a good idea to look at the abstract nouns in the poem, and very often consider the fact that both the poets use these words ironically, though in a different way. So word spirit is not used in the same way as people do. It's used in a different way, and this different way of using the same word is what poetry is about. Poetry renews the language, it extends the possibilities of language, it uses same words in a different way. And irony is one way of doing that. Look at the words like new man, and it becomes ironic here. New man, in a traditional conventional way of saying new man, is different from the way in which Mark Strand uses the word new man. For him, new man is none other than dog. I want to end my discussion by giving you certain names of books which you might find useful for appreciating poetry. And these are very popular books. Have a look. The first book is Clint Brooks and Robert Penn Warren's Understanding Poetry, which appeared in 1976. It's something like a textbook for comprehension of poetry. More recent one is Edward Hirsch, How to Read a Poem and Fall in Love with Poetry, which appeared in 2000. Another very interesting book is Harold Bloom, The Art of Reading Poetry, which appeared in 2005. And more recent one is Terry Eagleton's How to Read a Poem, which appeared in 2007. So these 4 books are very useful for you to understand how poem works, how poetry works. So we started out with trying to figure out what poetry is and why is it important. And I said it's important because it's everywhere. Our sacred books, it's in film songs, it's in titles of the serials, it's everywhere. And we also found out that poetry is one of the ways in which culture reproduces and produces itself, and that's why we study it. Then we started thinking about how does poem work. Then I said the poem works by dancing. It works in a different way than the prose works. I also began by asking what is poetry, by looking into the etymological definition of poetry, and I said that word poetry comes from poenin, which is to make. So poetry is something which is made or crafted. So with these points, I looked at 2 poems, Slumber Did My Spirit Seal and Eating Poetry by Mark Strand. And I looked at both this poem in some detail, looking at how figures of speech, how metaphors, similes, images, irony, symbolism functions in the poem, to give you some idea of how poem works, what is the mechanism of the poem. And I hope that this discussion has actually made you more interested in reading poetry. And I'm sure you will go into your classroom next time with more interest when you're attending a poetry classroom. So thanks a lot for listening to me, and this is where I stop. Thank you.